Before we get to our number ones, can I ask a question?
Please.
So I threw out a question on Facebook today that I kind of wanted to ask here too, especially because it ties into my number one a little bit. But why do we love scary movies?
I don't.
You love some of them.
Yeah, it's true.
Actually, the comment that Malachi Ward made was pretty spot on, but I'll just read mine. Horror films, especially when using fictional monsters, zombies, vampires, etc., they allow us to explore our fears from a safe place because we can say to ourselves, well, the zombies aren't real. So we can sit in the tension of seeing the world as we know it fall apart because surreal monsters as opposed to real humans are causing the destruction. And I tend to like thrillers and dark comedies, and for different reasons. I'm not a fan of jump scare horror, but I do love dark comedies because that's kind of how I see life sometimes. Not that I'm like emo or brooding all the time, but I feel like even in our darkest moments, there are glimpses of humor and stupidity, and it's a release, from that darkness. And then for the technical aspects of what I'm calling thrillers, I love when I see great camera work and coupled with a great solid score. It builds tension to the point where I can't take it anymore, and that's just such a great time in watching films. And mostly I love them, but it's part of my upbringing too. It's something very special to me because I would watch horror movies pretty much every weekend with my dad and my brother, and it's just what we did. We just watched horror movies, and so I have so many in my brain that it's kind of like, I don't know, I guess going to the park or what other kids did. It's like that special thing. So I love horror films.
I think it's interesting to me because as society has become a little bit more relativistic in its value systems, which means you're allowed to have your value system and you're allowed to have your value system, and like those can exist on separate planes and not interact with one another. You're allowed to have your truth, right? I think it's really funny when you talk about horror because there are some exceptions to this, but if you go across the different forms of horror in the different cultures that horror exists, even going back into time, into artwork that people created before there was ever such a thing as movies, and they said like, this is a demonic figure, this is not. There's consistency in it all, right? There's consistency across all of these things, which then makes me go, well, if there's consistency across it, then it isn't truly relative, then is it? Because if every single person goes, oh yeah, that's scary, if you can identify scary. Now, granted, we might have little quibbles here and there about what isn't scary or what isn't good character design or something, but for the most part, we can all agree, like, okay, that's scary. So I think horror, there's something beyond. Oftentimes, it's related to our comfort level. Oftentimes, it's related to fear, right? So, like, why do we fear? When we do fear, what does it cause us to do? What does fear cause us to do? And it causes us to oftentimes not love. It often causes us to retreat into selfishness. We're going to dive a little bit more into that when we dive into some of these movies that we're going to talk about. Yeah. But I think it's an interesting. I think one of the reasons why people love scary movies is because it's a chance to explore something in a safe place because it's on the screen. But it's still a universal truth that fear exists and darkness exists. And what do we do with that? How does that impact our lives? Why does it impact our lives? And I think that's one of the reasons that people really love horror, is they go, I can feel those feelings as a kind of a release, and I can process these things that they're talking about, but those aren't actually happening to me. Even though below the surface, there might be truth to some of those things being out there in the world. Whether it's spiritual, whether it's like 10 Cloverfield Lane, where you're going like, is he crazy? Right? There's people out there that are like that dude, and so I think that there's this underlying truth of fear and darkness and evil that exists, and I think it's our processing of that.
Couldn't have said better myself.
It's interesting that you bring up this the fact that we're all the same when we talk about evil and how what we understand to be evil, because there are some films that do kind of point that out and say it's an apologetic in a sense that they will convince people that evil exists, and in doing that they believe in God. And it sounds like a stretch, but that is the apologetic that some films have gone for, like The Right and Deliver Us from Evil. That's that theme that they're going with, is to reveal that true evil does exist, and why does it exist, and who makes it exist, or like what's responsible for that. So it's really interesting to think about. There was
a study done because I think you can contrast horror and fear and the aesthetic of horror and fear with beauty. And you'll find a lot of times in our culture too, we start to talk about beauty in terms of like people's features. But if you think about beauty in a bigger, wider context, there's this concept that they've done studies. I heard about this. This was done a TED Talk. Actually, you can go listen to the TED Radio Hour. There's a TED Talk on it, and they talk about actually across all cultures, if people were to describe the most beautiful landscape, it's always the same. It's always like these rolling hills, because they're not too big, so you can still traverse them. There's grass, so there's plenty of foliage. There's a few trees, so you can get shade, and there's always like a brook going through it, so you can get water. And I think that if there's a commonality to what we consider beautiful, I'm pretty confident you can make an argument that there's a commonality to what we consider horrendous and evil and dark. And what's interesting about that to me is I go, why would we think that? Like, in other words, you don't grow up in like sometimes you could say, well, you're nurtured into it, right? Because like they throw a really scary looking person at you, and then it's loud noises, and like, okay, well, maybe that would make you. But why do you fear that? Why do you fear that, but don't fear this other person who looks normal? And I think it's just a very interesting thing to start to explore. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know about that. But I think those things are really interesting.
I will say, I was on vacation for 2 weeks. We went to the Field Museum, and they had this one exhibit that was all about like Polynesia and stuff, and they had this one segment that was all about the spiritual world.
Oh yeah. And
you could go through and you just saw all these different masks and all these different things. It was pretty terrifying, I have to say. We just go in, you just see all these weird faces. It's like you go to the tiki room and it's like it's all nice and everything, and then you go into the actual museum and look at all this stuff, and I'm like, there's a lot of eyes looking at me right now. This is real. Yeah. It's pretty creepy.
It sounds like it.
First of all, there's a couple like not profound utilities to horror films for me. Like, I don't watch them very often, but every now and then I find myself wanting to watch something scary. And it's usually specifically because for the last 3 days, the majority of what I've watched is Sesame Street, Transformers Rescue Bots. And, cartoons that my sons watch. Yeah. So I want the polar opposite of that. I want something darker. But from what I understand, in the movie industry, horror is widely considered to be an inexpensive medium. So, like, it's cheap to make a horror film.
Correct.
So I think one thing that leads to is a lot of them get made, and they will take risks with them and let filmmakers really kind of dive in and use their craft because it doesn't cost them that much money. It's not like Infinity War where Disney's going to choke the heck out of it because it has to be perfect because they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it. And so I think what you end up with, sometimes it's just your run-of-the-mill, lots of blood, everybody's dying, blah, blah, blah. I've seen it a million times before. But you do get a lot of, like, really great filmmakers exhibiting a really high level of craft because the cheap nature of making it lets them do that.
Yeah.
So I think that's cool. And then for me, on a higher level, I wouldn't say horror movies, but scary movies. Most of the movies that I can think of that have this are not, I wouldn't necessarily classify as horror, but they have a very specific reason why it's scary. And it usually has to do with how much you care about the characters. It's not so much how frightening is the villain or how scary is the music or how many jump scares are there. They make you care about who you're watching, and therefore the peril that they put them in is frightening.
So that's very true.